Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the statutory public meeting. With regards to the two items, 4.1 and 4.2, are there any disclosures of interest? Seeing none. Again, there are two items. Item 4.1 is the building application fees review for 2022 or of 2022-100. We have our planning and building staff here today. Denise will answer any questions that you may have. And online we have Jim Bruzzese, who will be providing our presentation this evening. Jim, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I believe the presentation is being called up. So this evening I'd like to review the process for establishing the building permit fees. So if you go to the next slide, the first thing we did, as pointed out on the next slide, is we set goals and objectives for the calculation of the building permit user fees. And those being, the goals and objectives being compliance with the legislation, that the fees are fair and equitable to all classes of permits, and the fees are proportional to the actual cost of the service. The building permit user fees are eligible to recover 100% of the cost of the service. So our calculations are based on the recovery based on 100% of the cost of service. Next slide. Just by way of background, it's been a number of years since the wholesale review of the building permit fees has been undertaken. And then since that last review, there's been a number of process changes. There's been increased regulatory requirements, increased public expectations requiring more information. Applications are becoming more complex, a lot more infill and intensification type applications. Additional staff to follow up with public and applicants is required. And a leading practice, because of the changes, the ongoing changes of the legislation, a leading practice is to undertake a comprehensive review of fees at least every 5 years. So all of these changes has resulted in obviously increased staff time associated with issuing a building permit and the inspection process. So in terms of the process that we've undertaken to calculate the fees, if we go to the next slide, this is a schematic of what we did in the calculation of the fees. First of all, we established the purpose of the cost of service, which was, as I said, to recover 100% of the cost of building permit fees. We've undertaken a legislative review to see what is acceptable under the legislation. And essentially the legislation states that the calculation of building permit fees are not to exceed the anticipated cost of the service. So we're within that realm. We undertook staff interviews to find out activities and opportunities, challenges that currently building permit staff were facing with the calculation of the fees. We undertook some process mapping, which I'll describe a little bit later in the presentation, the detail on that. And then from that, we were able to do activity-based costing to calculate the fees. And we did that fee calculation, and to ensure the reasonableness of that, what we did is we benchmarked the fee calculation against all of the rest of the Niagara municipalities. And that leads us up to this evening, which is the review, the public meeting, and then after the public meeting, council decision. Next slide, please. So just to describe some of those processes in a little bit more detail. First of all, I talked about full cost accounting and recovery of 100% of the cost of service. So what that entailed is looking at the direct departmental costs That's essentially the salaries and wages of the building department staff that are undertaking the permit examination and the inspection. Then we added to that indirect departmental costs. There are things like car allowance, staff training, some of the ancillary expenses that staff face in the conduct of their activities. And then we also rolled in corporate cost allocations. And these were provided to us from the finance department. And essentially what the corporate cost allocations entail are things like costs incurred by the finance department on behalf of the building department, systems costs, accommodation, that type of thing. So those elements come up to calculate the 100% of the cost of providing the service. The next thing, if we go to the next slide, I talked briefly about the process map. Essentially, what the process map entailed was identifying all the steps in the process. So it's each activity related to plans, examination, and inspections. We identified who was involved in each of those activities. We then identified how much time, on average, there's different elements that could skew the time, but we for the best of our for the calculation purposes, we used an average for each step that staff undertake for each of the activities. And then finally, we prepared a process map that showed each of the staff, the time for each of the staff to enable us to do the user fee calculation. The next slide. So in terms of the building permit fee calculation, as I said, we did the legislative review, and the legislation states that the provincial regulation that sets the uniform and minimum standards required to be adhered to in the construction of buildings. The main purpose of the building code is to protect public health, safety, and general welfare as it relates to the construction and occupancy of the building and structures. And municipalities are obviously responsible for the enforcement of the Ontario Building Code. And through the legislation, they're allowed to collect 100% of the cost of service through building permit fees. And then those collection of fees are from those who directly benefit of the services, being the applicant. So this entails that essentially what it allows is growth to pay for growth. And the building permit fee should be 100% cost recovery based on from the user fees and no taxpayer subsidy. The one stipulation in the building code, and I mentioned it earlier, is that it requires that permit fees not exceed the anticipated reasonable cost to administer and enforce the act. And obviously we adhere to that. So the next slide, please. So this is essentially the calculation of the fees for new construction. And you can see from this calculation, we looked at the various groups. Group A would being assembly type occupancies. And in the Group A, the existing fee that you're charging is $1.66 per square foot. And based on that costing analysis and activity-based costing, the calculated fee works out to $1.93 a square foot. If we look at Group C, residential occupancies, which is probably the most relevant, the current charge is $1.33 per square foot, and the calculated cost is $1.43. So it's about a 10-cent per square foot increase. So if you're looking at an average house of maybe 1,800 square feet, that equates to a $180 increase on that house, that new construction. So next slide, please. So as I say, after we calculated the fees, the next step in the process to make sure that they're reasonable is to compare the fees against the other Niagara municipalities. And yeah, we realize that there's many factors that impact the fees in each of the various jurisdictions. Things like processes, they're slightly different in some of the municipalities. Some municipalities have different cost recovery goals and objectives. Turnaround times, performance standards have an impact on the cost, the number of resources. And some of the Niagara municipalities haven't updated their fees in a number of years. So taking that into consideration as well. So overall, what we did find is Port Colborne's fees tend to be lower than the average of the Niagara municipalities. So we look at the next slide. So as I say, we did that comparison with the other municipalities. And what we show on each of these various classes of properties is the existing, which you can see in yellow, and then Port Colborne calculated fee, which is the green, and how it compares against each of the Niagara municipalities. So you can see an assembly type property, the calculated fee is just slightly above the average of the Niagara municipalities. We go to the next slide. Institutional, the same thing. You're just above the average. Your existing fee is quite low in comparison to the other Niagara municipalities. Next slide. Residential houses. You can see the Port Colborne existing is the second lowest in the comparator group, the current charge. And now you're just slightly above the average. One of the municipalities that kind of skews the average, you can see from this, is Niagara Falls. And the reason for that is Niagara Falls has a lot of commercial development, and the charges on the commercial development are quite large, and it's offsetting the cost for the residential houses. So it is skewing the average, you can see from this. And as I mentioned earlier, based on 180 or 1,800 square foot house, the increase is about $180. The next class is office. And you can see, again, it's just slightly above the average on that. Your current fee is the second lowest in the survey. The next slide is mercantile storefront operations. And again, just slightly above the average. The next slide is industrial. And again, you can see in comparison to the average, you're almost at the average. And as I said previously, Niagara Falls in a lot of these cases are kind of skewing the average just because of the makeup of the type of development that is occurring in Niagara Falls. If we go to the next slide. Just by way of conclusion, the recommended building permit fees will continue to be competitive, as you saw from our charts with other Niagara municipalities. And based on the projected activity levels that we looked at, the projected revenues, based on the user fee calculations, will move the city to full cost recovery. So our recommendations are the 2022 fees be approved based on the full cost recovery, that you apply an annual inflationary increase to all building permit fees to help ensure that the fees keep pace with the changes in the cost of service. And then every 5 years, as I mentioned earlier, a full analysis of building service costs. It's recommended that it be undertaken. And that's the end of the presentation. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Great, thanks, Jim. Really appreciate that. Ms. Landry, anything to add?
Can I be heard from here?
No, you got to go to the podium.
Sorry, this is my first rodeo. Through the mayor to the councillors. I just wanted to highlight that we anticipate bringing a recommendation back forward either the next meeting in June or the beginning of July. And we anticipate, if council supports the increase in the fees, making them effective August 1st of this year.
Perfect. So council, questions to either Ms. Landry or our presenter? Councillor Bruno.
Thank you, Worship. To the consultant reporter, you mentioned just at the end of your presentation that you'd recommend adding CPI every 5 years, or sorry, every year, and then doing a review every 5 years. certainly certain municipalities in Niagara have taken off explosively in the housing markets at different times. And based on 4,500 approved homes in Port Colborne, I'm just wondering, you say the recommendation is every 5 years. If our costs may not spike in tandem with growth, so you may bring on a secondary inspector or have some costs associated with building permits that are there to where growth will catch up to the cost. So is a 5-year recommendation an absolute? And you have to do a full-blown reconsideration and analysis to raise the fees beyond CPI?
Mr. Brzez?
Yeah, through you, Your Worship. First of all, if you're anticipating some fairly significant growth, and what would result in that? There would be an increase in activity. The way the process maps are undertaken, we calculated the number of hours for each of the activities within a building permit process. And that's how we come up with the cost. So if your activity levels increase, in other words, the number of houses that you're building increases, that could warrant an extra staff, for example, just to keep up with the demand. But that extra staff, that would be recovered off through the increase in the activity levels that would be occurring. When we say annual inflationary increases, again, that's to keep up with salary and wage increases, which is the bulk of the expenses. The full analysis every 5 years would then take into account if there's any process changes that have significantly skewed the building permit fee calculation. So that's the reason for that. However, 5 years is not set in stone, and there could be some instances that could trigger a full user fee review before that 5-year period.
Councillor?
Thank you. I guess that's where I was going. Obviously, when you do these every 5 years, if in the perfect world, the new growth would pay for the new expenses and CPI would take care of wage inflation. But I'm sure that you found that for the most part, there still are changes. That's the reason I asked for if that's cast in stone. The other one I wanted to ask is the only way to build a reserve to have surpluses?
Mr. Brzez?
No, you can build into the cost transfer to reserve calculation. Your reserves currently are about, I believe, $250,000. Your expenses are about $500,000. So your reserves currently are about 50% of the expenses. Leading practice is to have reserves at around 100%. But what we anticipate is that you are possibly having some significant growth spurts, which would most likely create some surpluses that could be transferred to reserve. So we didn't build into the bottom line is we didn't build into the calculation a transfer to reserve. We think that you have a fairly healthy building reserve currently, and we think that you could have some future inflation or surpluses to transfer to the reserve. But again, when you look at the results, and if economic conditions, for example, change, then that's a time to relook at the fees.
I guess I want to revisit what you've just said. So certainly things can go the other way. Interest rates go up. The homes don't get going. I guess overall where I'm going with this is to try and build a reserve closer to that 100%. And it sounds like you're telling me some communities build in a factor, it doesn't have to be very much, given where we are on that chart, to get them to 100%. In fact, there may be people with fees higher than us that have built in a charge. Are you telling me that in your calculations, there's no money built in to catch up to 100%? And the only way now to get that is ensure that fees exceed expenses, ergo a surplus.
Mr. Brzez?
Yes, that is correct. As I said, your reserve currently is about 55% of the expenses. That'll help through a downturn in the economy. But to get to the 100% based on the fee calculation we have now, we haven't built in that transfer to reserve, and we're relying on surpluses.
So if I could, are there any other municipalities on that chart in Niagara that have built in a factor to get their reserve up to satisfy any major blip in the market?
Mr. Brzez?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. A lot of those municipalities, they don't publish the underlying expenditures, so it's hard to determine if any of them do. I am familiar with a couple of them, having undertaken the studies on their behalf, and just for example, West Lincoln was probably the most recent. They have not built in transfer to reserve, and there are a couple other municipalities that do not have. I know for a fact that do not have a transfer to reserve. In fact, I don't know of any offhand that actually have built that into the calculation.
Two more questions. One, just a response to that. So I thought what you were saying is the beginning is that you don't have any way of, that municipalities don't publish that, but don't they have to show how they built the fees? And some of that is transferred to reserves if they've, in a positive way, tried to do that. In other words, not just rely on surplus. I guess I'm caught between hearing that some do, but it's not disclosed. How does that happen, or did I read you wrong?
Mr. Brzez?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. The reports, similar to the report that we just produced, don't have that detailed calculation of the fees. Obviously, it is available at the municipalities. It is public information, but it's not published where it's evident that we can see it.
So this circles back to my first question. If there's a downturn, if that 250,000 at 50% starts sinking, are we needing to wait 5 years to do something about not draining that reserve because the market's going in the wrong direction or our fees are too low? That was because, as you've said, some of these municipalities may be above us and they still haven't even done their next review. So I'm just worried about the low end and this coming back on the taxpayer, or we're getting to that fine line. $250,000 in a department that spends $500,000 is like a half a year. So in theory, if the growth we have dropped in half, we could be digging into that reserve again. So my concern is, were the fees high enough? And obviously your analysis says that they're accounting for everything, but I just see the potential for a cloud on the horizon that could be avoided with a small increase, which I don't think will deter development. So I guess I'm still wondering if, to come back to this, I don't want to have a no rescue plan and have to wait for 5 years.
Mr. Brzez?
Through you, Mr. Chairman. The 5-year time frame is not cast in stone. It's a recommendation that on a minimum basis it be done every 5 years. If circumstances change, even during a year, council does have the ability to review the fee calculation and to undertake an in-year review, actually, of the fees to make up any shortfalls.
Thank you. And maybe one through you to the CAO, Ramir. Have we had, Mr. Mr. Bowles look at this in terms of the whole financial output? Or like, will he have a chance to comment before we pass, or is his input warranted? Could be asked.
Sure, through your worship to Councillor Bruno, I know that he has been involved in working with staff on some of the fees and even the ways, if you remember a few slides from the very first slide is the one where they talk about the different input costs that are calculated. The other thing is that when it comes to the staff report level for approval, there will be that financial implications section of the staff report, which will be completed by staff with Brian, with Mr. Bowles. So today is just the public meeting. When it's actually at the staff report stage, you will have those comments from finance and treasury.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you to the presenter.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Danch? Councillor Danch? You have your hand up?
Yes, I have. Yes,
Thank
yes,
you.
thank you. It seems like a marginal increase. $180 on a building permit for a home. It's not tremendous, and hopefully the people will accept something like that. I just wonder, and it's probably not a question for the consultant there, but like, will the regional fees be increased? Because I don't know if people understand the fact that more of your building fees go to the region than go to the city themselves. Yeah. And I just wonder if that will come into play.
Thank you, Councillor. Ms. Lander?
Through the mayor to the councillor. So this fee is strictly looking at the city's building permit fees. When an application does come in, we do collect regional and city development charges. That's kind of a separate component. This is strictly looking at city building permit fees.
Councillor?
No, I just wondered if those fees are going to increase as well, as far as the development side of things, or is it strictly the building permit fees?
Yeah. CAO?
Sure. Through your worship to Councillor Danch, we are talking internally at the senior staff level about a development charge review. So separate from permit fees is our development charges. I can't say what schedule the region is on. Mr. Brzezzi talked about the 5-year review of building permit fees. The 5-year review of development charges is mandatory under the DC Act. So we have to do it every 5 years. We may choose to bring something to council a little bit sooner just because so much has changed in the operating environment since the last time that was done. So I would look for a staff report before the end of the year that talks about laying out a schedule for city development charges. The region, I would have to ask their staff. Maybe I can report back verbally at the next council meeting.
You're in the middle of it now.
Oh, sorry. The mayor, who is a regional councillor, advises that it is taking place as we speak.
Yeah.
Okay, just like, you don't know unless you ask the question, and I'm sure anybody that's proposing to do some construction is always looking at the cost of doing things. And I say the region gets more of our money than the city itself, so people need to know that part of it before they go overboard at City Hall at the desk and say, hey, listen, how come it costs so much? Well, listen, guys, it's not necessarily us. It's the other people that are really dinging us. So just a little food for thought. Thank you.
Yeah, and just to clarify, Councillor, with regards to these fees aren't applied by the region at all. It's only the development charges. We're the only ones that do the building fees, correct? Ms. Lander? That's correct, okay. Just, there is no building fee at the region, it's just the development charge.
And I understand that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. All right, Councillor Bagia?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to the consultant or Ms. Landry, with the Ontario government proposing a new law requiring a certain amount of time for the permits to become approved, or else there's a penalty, the applicant gets the money back. Does this have to do with building application fees, or is this the developmental fees?
Ms. Lander?
Through the mayor to the councillor, you're referring to Bill 109, and that is strictly related to Planning Act applications, specifically site plan applications, zoning bylaw amendments, official plan amendments, and plans of subdivision. So it does not have anything to do with building permit application fees.
Oh, she put me in my place, Mr. Mayor. Thank you.
No problem, good question. Okay, anything further, council? Nothing further? Oh, Councillor Bodnar?
Back to some of Councillor Bruno's comments and our ability to react if things go south. I guess either through the CAO or the consultant, do we have to hire a consulting company? Not that we don't like yours, but, or can we do that internally? Like, can we just,
I'll go to the CAO on this. Mr. CAO?
Sure, through your worship to Councillor Bodnar, and I'll let other staff and Jim here, who's on the line, jump in if they'd like to. I think this is really about having a template or a model that we can apply time in and time out so that we can do these studies in-house. Some cities and towns do building permit reviews, fee reviews in-house. It really, the tricky part is getting all of those costs that were mentioned in those slides, because sometimes the trying to find the right word here. The complicated part of it is the very indirect costs. And when I say indirect, and outside of the department. So sometimes it's easy to say, there's this much mileage and this much of the mileage was for building and so on. But we can get to the level here of certainty where we talk about how much of the HR department's time was involved in hiring building people, and how much of the CAO's time was attributable to approving building reports for council. And that's all recoverable, and that helps, to use the phrase that Mr. Brzezzi used, that helps that growth pays for growth or building pays for building, because anything that's not paid for by building and goes to the general levy is in fact subsidized by every taxpayer, and that's something we're trying to avoid. So I would suggest that there's a template here that can be applied in the future and save us on those consulting fees.
Councillor? All set? Okay. Any further questions? Okay. Thank you, Jim. Appreciate it. There is a recommendation that Development and Legislative Services Department Report 2022-100 be received for information. If I could have Councillors Danch and Kalaloff move that. Last call for questions or comments. Councillor?
To Councillor Bodner's point, to the consultant, can one, if we have to revisit, can one say that if the reserve falls below 50%, that an automatic review or relook happens? So at least we stop the slide before it's slid to the bottom.
Mr. Brzezzi?
Through you, Mr. Chairman, yes, you can do that, certainly.
Thank you.
Okay, good. Thank you. Seeing no further questions, all those in favor, please raise your hand. Opposed? That's carried unanimously. Perfect. And again, Jim, thank you for your work on this. And we look forward to us moving forward and not having to do a review that we're so successful in the cities of Colborne.
Absolutely.
Great. Ms. Landry, thank you. Okay, it's past 5:30 because our next public meeting was scheduled for 5:30 at earliest starting time, so this is good. At this time, we have a public meeting report for proposed zoning bylaw amendment at 1498 Wilhelm Road, 2022-127. We'll have Christopher Wilson will be attending on behalf of owner Andy Veenstra, and Mr. Room will be looking at this. Mr. Room, go ahead.
Thank you, Mayor Steele. Good evening, councillors and any members of the public that may be attending virtually. The purpose of this application, just give Simon a second, there we go. The purpose of this application pursuant to Section 34 of the Planning Act is to consider an application initiated by Christopher Wilson for the land known as Lot 5 on Concession 2. Formerly in the Township of Humberstone, now in the City of Port Colborne, Regional Municipality of Niagara, municipally known as 1498 Wilhelm Road. The application for zoning bylaw amendment proposes to change the zoning from agricultural to agricultural purposes only and agricultural residential. A special provision of the bylaw is being sought to permit a reduced lot frontage for the parcel to be zoned agricultural residential. The notice of public meeting was administered in accordance with Section 34 of the Planning Act as amended and Ontario Regulation 545/06. The notice of public meeting was circulated to required agencies and property owners within 120 meters of the lands on May 25th, 2022, and public meeting signs were also posted on the property no later than May 25th, 2022. Meeting details have been provided along with the council agenda on the city's website and under current applications. As of the date of this meeting, staff have received comments from the following agencies and no comments from the public have been received. From our drainage superintendent, the parcels are within the watershed of the Peter Storm Drain. This report is in the process of being updated and any changes will be corrected within the new report. And from our fire department, Port Colborne Fire has no objection to the application. The procedure to be followed this evening will be to present Planning and Legislative Services Report 2022-127. Hear any comments from the applicant, receive questions of clarification from staff to the applicant or planning staff, open the meeting to the public for comments and questions, and announce the requirements under the Planning Act for written notice of passage for the proposed zoning bylaw amendment. At this time, I would like to present Planning and Legislative Services Public Hearing Report 2022-127. There we go. So the property is located on the west side of Wilhelm Road and also borders Neff Road to the east, to the west there, and then Second Concession Road to the north. The surrounding land uses are primarily agricultural and residential. Next slide there. City of Port Colborne official plan designates the property as agricultural. Land uses in the agricultural designation include, but are not limited to, the cultivation of crops, storage and processing of produce, raising of livestock, greenhouses, small-scale agri-tourism, value-added agricultural activities, specialty agricultural uses, and agricultural-related accessory uses. Section 3.5.3 of the official plan will be used to assess the application when a recommendation report is brought forward at a future date. This section provides policies on the severance of agricultural land. The official plan designation is not proposed to be changed as a result of this application. Next slide there. The City of Port Colborne zoning bylaw 6575-3018 zones the property as agricultural, which permits the following uses: agricultural, accessory agricultural activities, agricultural use, agritourism and value-added uses, conservation uses, a detached dwelling that is existing at the date of the passing of the bylaw as a principal use on a new lot, a detached dwelling as a principal use on an existing lot of record, a kennel, a cannabis production facility, and uses, structures, and buildings accessory thereto. A portion of the property is also zoned as environmental protection, which will remain on the property. Next slide there. The application for zoning bylaw amendment proposes to change the zoning from agricultural to agricultural purposes only and agricultural residential. A special provision of the bylaw is being sought to permit a reduced lot frontage on the parcel to be zoned as AR. The zoning bylaw amendment is being requested as part of a farm consolidation and an anticipated condition of severance application B09-22-PC. At this time, I'd like to bring in the applicant for any further clarification.
I don't have anything to add to the comments. It's a fairly straightforward severance of a surplus farm dwelling. The hearing before the Committee of Adjustment was scheduled last week. It was deferred at the request of the region and the Conservation Authority, which are doing additional work, firstly on the septic system for the region, and secondly for the Conservation Authority to determine whether there's any floodplain issues to be dealt with. I assume that will be done within the next several weeks and will return before the committee shortly.
At this time, are there any questions of clarification for myself or the applicant?
None? Okay.
Sure. So before I open the meeting to the public, I would like to read the following. If a person or public body does not make oral submissions at a public meeting or make written submissions to the City of Port Colborne before a decision on the proposed zoning bylaw amendment is passed by council, the person or public body is not entitled to appeal the decision of the City of Port Colborne Council to the Ontario Land Tribunal. If a person or public body does not make oral submission at a public meeting or make written submission to the City of Port Colborne before a decision on the proposed zoning bylaw amendment is passed by council, the person or public body may not be added as a party to the hearing of an appeal before the Ontario Land Tribunal unless, in the opinion of the tribunal, there is reasonable grounds to do so. To any interested members of the public, if you would like to receive future notices regarding this application, please contact me by email at chris.room@portcolborne.ca or by phone at 905-835-2900, extension 205. Or at the city clerk at nicole.rubley@portcolborne.ca or extension 106. At this time, I would like to invite any members of the public who would wish to speak to this application to do so, which I don't think that there are any, unless there's any online.
No, thank you, Mr. Room. There are no members of the public in the chamber. There were none for virtual? None? Okay. Go ahead.
If you wish to be notified of the approval of the zoning bylaw amendment, you must make a written request to the clerk. Only those persons and public bodies that give the clerk a written request to the notice of the adoption and the passing of a zoning bylaw amendment will be given notice. The proposed zoning bylaw amendment and recommendation report will return to a future council meeting. This concludes the portion of the public meeting, and I will now turn the meeting back to you, Mayor Steele, to close the public portion of the meeting and receive the report for information.
Great, thank you, Mr. Room. Appreciate that. Thank you, Mr. Wilson, for attending this evening. So the recommendation is that Planning and Development Report 2022-127 be received for information. If I have Councillor Wells and Bodnar move that, are there any questions? Seeing none, all in favor? That's carried. So this ends our public portion of the meeting. We will be reconvening at 6:30 for our normal council meeting. So thank you for attending, anybody that's watching on our web page. And as Mr. Room said, if you need any information on that last planning act or planning issue, please contact him. This meeting is adjourned.